Thank you very much, Pat. Thanks a lot. Thank you. Thanks a lot. We are very, very pleased to be here. Judith and I love coming to places like this because, well, frankly, there are more Republicans probably in this room than in all of New York City. So we feel like we have at least a few people that agree with us. I was telling Pat and Dusty before that the people in New York City like the results that I got for them, but totally disagree with the ideas that lie behind those results. So hopefully you'll agree more with the ideas as well as the result. But thank you very much, Pat, for inviting me here and giving us the opportunity to talk to you. I feel very much at home at the Club for Growth, and I feel very much at home because I think we both understand the economic principles that are at the core of America's growth and leadership in the world. We believe that budgets are very important documents. To me, the New York City budget was the kind of core of what made the city move in the right direction or the wrong direction. And they force us to make decisions, and they force us to set priorities. You and I believe strongly in, I think, a very quintessential American idea. It's an idea that has inspired greater progress and brought more hope to human beings than just about any other in history. It's the idea of freedom. A very simple way to describe how do you create growth is freedom and then more freedom. When I look out on the battlefield of ideas, and when you've been mayor of New York City for 8 years, and you've been advancing on economic programs and on budget and on taxes, you've been advancing very, very strong conservative principles, you feel like you've been in a battleground. And you have been. I mean, it's a battle. So I see the Club for Growth operating in this battlefield like a team of special forces. You're on the front lines, and I don't know how important you realize you are. I had an organization in New York City that set the groundwork for almost everything that I achieved. And I could probably list 10 reasons why I achieved what I was able to achieve that had to do with other people and their efforts. But Manhattan Institute was probably just as responsible for the changes I was able to bring about as I was, because they set the intellectual climate on which you could argue for these ideas. So what you're doing is enormously important. It doesn't win every election, it doesn't win every battle, but over a period of time, it begins to educate people. They get to understand school choice. They get to understand health choice. They get to understand these things. These things are complicated, and sometimes the Democrats beat us because their soundbite is better than ours. So but our answer, our solution, is a lot better than theirs. So we need organizations like yours to educate the American people. Your economic vision to limit government and to expand freedom was exactly my blueprint for revitalizing New York City. In 8 years, we transformed New York City from what used to be described as the ungovernable city, the unmanageable city. There are books with both of those titles, by the way. New York is ungovernable, New York is unmanageable. And we transformed it into a city that Time magazine recognized as the best example of urban rebirth in the United States. We transformed it from the crime capital of America to the safest large city in America for 4 or 5 years in a row. We transformed it from the welfare capital of America to by far the biggest and the most successful welfare to work program any place in the country. And we did that because we had the idea and enforced it of giving people more choice, giving people more freedom. We began with personal security. None of it means anything unless you're personally secure. None of it means anything in New York City. None of it means anything in Baghdad unless you're personally secure. Democracy can't exist without a reasonable degree of personal security. Not perfect, not 100%, but a reasonable degree of personal security. I said that about 4 or 5 days into being mayor of New York City. I said the most important and preeminent civil right is the right to be free from crime. And I was pilloried for the first of 1,000 times by the New York Times for demeaning civil rights, until I pulled out a quote of almost similar nature from Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who had said the same thing. And then they stopped criticizing me and went on to something else. But we also needed, when I took office, not just to deal with personal security, we needed to get the finances of the city under control. And we needed to do that to ensure that we could grow. When I first came into office, or when I was running for office, I was being told that we had something like a $800 million budget deficit. This was in a budget at that time, and I could be off the numbers. I don't remember exactly. My budget, I think, started at about a $34, $35 billion budget. So we were about $800 million in debt, in deficit. When I came into office, all of a sudden, and looked at the books, I realized it was $2.3 billion deficit, and we were halfway through the fiscal year when I took over. So I had to close a real gap, and I had 6 months to do it. In response, we imposed real fiscal discipline, and you can go examine it. We cut real programs, we cut real taxes, and we got real results that are measurable. In my first budget address to New York City, which I think was on February 2nd, 1994, I did it on television because we were in an emergency. We were in a fiscal emergency. And I'll quote to you what I said. I said we would, quote, cut taxes to attract jobs so our people can work. Now, that may seem self-evident to you. To New York City, this is almost heresy. I'm surprised the liberal Inquisition didn't come and condemn me for saying this. But I want you to know why that was so groundbreaking at the time. Because we had a deficit. Because we had a $2.3 billion deficit. How could somebody be talking about lowering taxes when we have a deficit? At least wait until we have a surplus, and then you can lower taxes. I'll tell you why I said it then. I said it then because at that time I believed in supply-side economics. I had worked for Ronald Reagan, and my thought was that if I could lower some of these taxes, I could grow my way out of the problem, both by reducing the size of government as much as I could, but you can't eliminate government, and then by finding the right taxes to reduce, I might have a lower rate, but I'd have a higher gross. I believed that. It was, for me at that time, it was an act of faith. But then I did it, and it worked. I did it. I got the hotel occupancy tax reduced by really about 30%, and I was collecting very quickly more money from the lower tax than from the higher one. And then I used that aggressively in my arguments to Democrats, largely, to get them ultimately to do 23 tax reductions for a total of about $9 billion. As I explained before, if it had been a Republican majority, I would have done double the number and probably $18 billion. In fact, if you look at it, I had some very, very big defeats. I would advocate for the total elimination of the unincorporated business tax, and then I would get it cut in half. But no one will ever know whether that was a defeat or a victory, because that's how you bring about reductions. You advocate for more, you find a place that you can meet, and then maybe you turn out being the victor. I understand fiscal conservatism, and I understand supply-side economics. George Will, a couple of weeks ago, in a column and a speech, described my administration as mayor of New York City as follows: the most successful episode of conservative governance in this country in the last 50 years. I don't completely agree with that. I think there was one other that was more conservative on fiscal policy, and that was my boss, Ronald Reagan. But being second to Ronald Reagan ain't bad. So what I'd like to do today is very, very briefly propose a set of ideas, a set of principles, a strategy for sustained growth and prosperity. These are all ideas we'll mention very briefly, and then during the course of this campaign, I guarantee you we will elaborate this in detail, because each one of them deserves detailed treatment. I call this the 4 pillars of prosperity, 4 things that we need to do in order to sustain our growth. 4 pillars of prosperity and then a single underlying principle of management called accountability, which makes growth possible. The first principle, the first pillar of prosperity is reducing spending growth. This will be achieved by setting priorities, by re-examining programs, by imposing fiscal discipline, and by re-examining what government is doing with the eye toward reducing anywhere you can reduce. Same thing you'd do in a business. If you took over a business that was spending too much money or losing money, first thing you do is you'd reduce spending. You'd find out, how do I reduce spending and get it under control? Second, lower tax rates. What we need simply is the lowest tax rates that we can get away with to create optimum growth in the private sector. Third, regulatory reform. We need to meet the basic requirements of health, of safety, transparency, integrity. All these things are important, but we also need reasonable rules, balanced rules that allow American ingenuity and American entrepreneurs to compete and win in the global economy. And if we burden them in ways that are unrealistic or overzealous burdens, then we hurt growth. It's just like, ultimately, just like taxation, and has to be seen that way. And fourth, we need a sound monetary policy. The Federal Reserve must conduct monetary policy to keep inflation low so that it doesn't interfere with the decisions that drive our economy. So let's begin with the first pillar, reduced spending and reduced spending growth. Conservatives understand the principle of bringing down government budgets. We believe in controlling spending, not just for its own sake. We believe in controlling spending because it makes government more efficient, it makes government more effective. The problem is that cutting spending is not politically popular, and in some places it's politically incorrect. And there are a lot of people who have the desire to cut spending and will announce that to you when they're running for office. But then the pressures of the incessant drumbeat of the Washington Post and the New York Times and the Sunday morning talk shows and all these things, and they move away from that agenda. You've got to guarantee that I'll do it. You've got to guarantee that I'll do it because I think in this race for president, I'm the only one who has done it. And done it in a place where it was tougher to do than in Washington. It's tougher to cut spending in New York City than it is in Washington, D.C. I'll tell you how I did it. I did it because I understood something from working for Ronald Reagan, and then I kind of transposed it to being mayor of New York City. What I understood was that if fiscal discipline doesn't come from the chief executive, it doesn't happen. I had great commissioners. I hope if I'm ever president, I'll have great cabinet secretaries. They all were geniuses at what they did, and most of my success came from what they did, and all the failures were my responsibility. You got to look at it that way if you want to be a leader. But the reality is, even with these great commissioners, I never had a commissioner ever walk into my office and say, "Mayor, give me a 10% cut from my agency. I'd like a little less money this year." I never had a member of the city council or a member of the state legislature, Democrat or Republican, ever tell me, "Cut money from my district. I'd like less programs. I'd like less money." So what does that mean? What that means is if it doesn't come from the chief executive, it's just inevitable that government will grow, and it will grow inefficiently. So fiscal discipline has to come from the top. You've got to impose cuts on these agencies. You've got to have them defend their budget. You've got to push back against that impulse to just spend more money, which is a natural one, but an unhealthy one. And the way you do that is by imposing across-the-board budget cuts. I did them anywhere from 5%. I think maybe the highest I did was 15. Might have been 20 the first year that I was in office and had to close that $2.3 billion gap. And then I would sit down and painstakingly, with the head of OMB, go through each one of their offers to reduce 5%, 10%, 15%, 20%. When they couldn't find 5 or 10 or 15%, then my director of OMB found it for them. And it didn't mean that we always sustained a 5 or 10 or 15% cut. It didn't mean we did it in every agency because you got to have priorities. But what it did mean was we held down spending growth. Sometimes we actually reduced spending for the first time just about in the history of the city. And what we did do, we reduced city government spending consistently over 8 years as a percentage of GDP. And New York's economy grew twice as fast as the city budget. And that hadn't happened maybe back with Peter Stuyvesant. I remember when that happened. But that didn't happen for a very, very long time. So being able to exercise fiscal discipline is enormously important. And if you do an analysis of our budget, as I did with the people that were advising me last week and the week before, and you look at what we're in for in the next 10 to 15 years with discretionary spending, and particularly what is described as non-discretionary spending, we need a president first that can talk about fiscal discipline. None of the Democrats can even talk about fiscal discipline. And we need a president that's actually practiced it and been, there in the battlefield and won battles for fiscal discipline. And I'm the only one that's done that. There's one idea that we'll offer quickly, then we'll offer a lot more as this campaign moves along. There's an opportunity to kind of revitalize and reinvent government, and to try and deal with this in an effective way. And that is to basically declare war on attrition. I did this effectively when I was mayor of New York City. I had to do some layoffs, but by and large, the way I reduced the workforce of the city, which I reduced by about 20,000, except for police officers and teachers, I did it by attrition. And that's what we have to do with the federal government. 42% of the federal civilian workforce for the federal government is due to retire during the next 2 presidential terms. That's about half the federal workforce due to retire. So if you have a Democratic president, what's going to happen? They're all going to get replaced, right? Probably increased. If you have a Republican president, I don't know what will happen. You can toss a coin up in the air, and some Republicans might exercise fiscal discipline. We've had some that have been great at it. We've had others that haven't. If I'm the president, you can be sure I will use that as a great opportunity to downsize federal government.